Good evening, everyone. My name's Heather Ramsey. I am the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Xwexwilmexw Government. I am just introducing this evening, and I was wondering if we could ask Grand Chief to start the evening with a prayer.
Okay. Grandfather, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for those that are in the circle with us this evening, those that may join us later on. Grandfather, we ask that you join us this evening and help us and guide us in our thoughts, our words, our actions. We ask you to help us open our mind and bring our minds and thoughts together as we discuss our topics this evening. Oh, Grandfather, oh.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's been a while since we've had an outreach event, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. We're happy to be here tonight and to see so many people on the screen. Thank you so much for coming. We've had a bit of a change tonight as to the program as Chief Chapman wasn't feeling well tonight, so it's just Grand Chief doing the presentation for us. And I just wanted to give a few Zoom housekeeping tips. I think we're going to keep our cameras off while the presentation is on, or maybe it doesn't even matter because I like actually seeing you all up there. But so there will be screen sharing the presentation, and at the end, for sure, when we have questions, you can definitely turn your camera back on and hopefully raise your hand and ask a question. We're also going to be doing some door prizes later. So that's also something, if you can rename yourself by clicking at the bottom under the participants and then the drop down menu there, so that we know who you are. That will help us with the door prize information. And what else was I going to say? Just wanting to let you know that after this, we will be planning another series of events. So this is meant to be a bit of a refresher and a bit of a history of the work that has been taking place and where we're at this point in time. So without further ado, I think I will let Grand Chief Stephen Point, who has been one of the guiding forces behind this work for so long, and just let him start with the slideshow that we're going to have for you tonight. I will share my screen.
Can you show the first slide then, Heather? Why treaty now? And this is essentially the topic that we're going to be talking about. I get this question an awful lot. Why are we doing treaty now? And I'm hoping that at the end of this discussion, we'll have a better idea of what's going on and why we're doing this work. Okay, could you show the next slide? The objectives tonight is these. I think these questions, I hope, will be touched on, not entirely answered, but what is a treaty? We're going to talk about that. The reason we are in negotiations, what we have negotiated so far, and what we're not going to talk so much about the other options. We're going to mention that very briefly. That's going to become a topic for our next podcast. The Xwexwilmexw vision. And essentially that is for self-government, and we're not going to do next steps either, but that's part of our another podcast. Okay, can we go on to the next slide then? We're going to begin talking about, you'll see the wonderful blanket that's been woven here to represent the hereditary chief's authority. This is how our government used to work before contact with Europeans. There was a set of hereditary chiefs that governed every tribe, and there were CMs that governed the families. So the Chilliwack tribe, or the Xwexwilmexw tribe, is an example of one of the tribal units you'll see there. And the hereditary chiefs were called Chief Siam, and the elders of the families were called Siam. So just very briefly, prior to white contact, Indigenous people lived off their lands, governing themselves according to their own ways and traditions. They took care of their lands according to their beliefs and teachings. The land was considered to be the mother, and we were the children. The trees considered to be alive, we could only take trees that were already cut down, or if needed for construction for longhouses or canoes. We took medicine plants after asking permission and explaining why the plant was needed. We would leave a small payment for the plant in exchange for the plant materials, the roots and the bark, etc. The animals were considered our older brothers with minds of their own. We respected them and took only enough for food or for trade. We never wasted food or disrespected the animals by leaving any parts in the ground. We used every part of the animal as food or clothing or tool making. When the whites came, our land was taken up by white settlers, and the white settlers began to impose their laws on our land that belonged to us, the Stalo. Although we were aware of the treaties being signed in other parts of Canada, we also sought a treaty with the whites government. Our land was being taken up without our knowledge and our consent and without any compensation. So go on to see slide number 4. In those days, it was clear government policy to buy the land from the Indians first and then open the land up for white settlement. From the land that was left over, reserve lands were set aside for the use and benefit at a rate of about 10 acres per family of 5, even though in other parts of Canada, it was common practice to allow up to 160 acres per family of 5. Governor Douglas and Governor Seymour promised large reserve lands, and then they later on reduced them as they thought the Indians didn't use the land the way the whites did. They reduced these lands and gave rise to what was called the cutoff land question. Our chiefs began to press for recognition of our land rights, both for compensation for our homelands now being taken up by white settlers, and for the smallness of our reserve lands. This became what is called the land question. For many years, these questions were ignored by various white governments. They said that we in BC had no right to our homeland nor to our reserves. In the case of our reserve lands, Joseph Truch, one of the early colonial land commissioners, began to take back some of the land that were promised by Governor Douglas. In some cases, lands that were already set aside as reserves would be taken back by the government for white settlers, or for roads, or for other public purposes. Go on to slide number 5. So the Stalo sent delegations to various governments to make a plea for a treaty and larger reserves for the Stalo. They sent delegations to Victoria and to Ottawa and even to England. At one point in history, in 1864, a new governor, Governor Seymour, on the Queen's birthday in Westminster, made a statement. He said to the Indians assembled that because we did not have a treaty, that the Indians would still own their lands, that the whites would only use a shovel depth of land for farming, that we, the Stalo, would earn 25 cents on every dollar earned by the whites on our homelands for as long as the sun set and the river flowed. This promise was recorded and reported by the federal government during a hearing in the year 1921. Our chiefs, Peter Kelly and Andrew Paul, reminded the government about these crown promises. That commission ended by deciding that Aboriginal rights to the land was extinguished in BC by early colonial land law and by the extension of British sovereignty in 1858. BC continued to ignore Indigenous pleas for the recognition of our rights. After the First and Second World War, however, in which Indians from across Canada fought and died in these wars, the Indian Act was amended in 1951, allowing Indians to vote and repealing the anti-potlatch laws in the Indian Act. Indians were allowed to politically press for the recognition of their land rights once again, This rights had been taken away by order in 1921. The Nisga's began to press for the recognition of their Aboriginal land rights by forming the Nisga'a Tribal Council and by commencing a legal action in Supreme Court that argued in BC that the Nisga'a still owned their homelands despite early statements by the federal and provincial governments. Go on to slide number 6. In 1973, the Supreme Court of Canada handed down its split decision. 3 judges decided that their rights, the Nisga's rights, had been extinguished by early colonial laws, and 3 judges decided that the Nisga'a still owned their homelands, and the 7th judge decided that Nisga'a could not bring a suit against the Crown without the Crown's consent. This was a technical defeat for the Nisga'a, but a real victory for the struggle to recognize Indigenous rights in British Columbia, because all 6 judges did agree that Nisga'a did have Aboriginal land rights. They only split on the issue of extinguishment. It was then that the federal Liberals under Trudeau began the modern process to extinguish Aboriginal land rights through treaty making. At first, the province of British Columbia would not come to the negotiation table, arguing that if the feds were wanting to recognize Indigenous land rights, they would have to pay the Indians. Go on to slide number 7. Later on, under the Vanderzam provincial government of BC, came to the table as full participants in the negotiations process. This negotiations process for modern treaties began in 1993. The First Nations Summit and Canada and British Columbia established the BC Treaty Commission Agreement, a made in BC process different than comprehensive claims that were had set the guiding principles. 6 stages of the BC Treaty Commission were established. BC has, since Premier Harker, taken the general view that because Indians represent only 5% of the BC population, though only 5% of the land could be returned to them under any treaty. The feds have taken the general position that no compensation could be paid for lands already taken, but a lump sum of money is always negotiated. It's a signing bonus based on Indigenous population. The feds began the process by insisting that the Nisga'a extinguish their general rights to their homelands in exchange for fee simple lands granted under the treaty. The Nisga'a agreed to this and were widely criticized for this treaty because of this issue of fee simple land, because it meant that eventually the Nisga'a lands would be subject to BC land tax laws. The Nisga'a also had to agree to borrowing their funds to negotiate a treaty. The province of British Columbia, however, put in 20% of the loan funds that were not repayable. In 1969, the Union of BC Chiefs also established the fight for the recognition of Aboriginal rights to the land generally, they called the general claim, and specifically to seek justice for the reserve lands taken back or sold unlawfully. That was called specific claims. When the Union of BC Chiefs began to interview elders throughout BC, I was involved in that process at the time. It was clear that the various tribes and nations did not want to extinguish their general land rights to their homelands. They were also opposed to the process of borrowing funds in order to make treaties. They wanted an ongoing recognition of their rights. They wanted to return to protecting their lands and managing their own resources, i.e., through self-government. Slide number 8, please. Canada began the process, however, of devolution. That is, their objective of getting out of the business of Indians, i.e. their fiduciary obligation to act in the best interest of the Indian rights. In 1969, Canada announced their intention to seek advice on the idea of ending Indian reserves by giving these lands to the Indians in fee simple, making us taxpayers in the provincial land system. There was a general negative reaction to this so-called white paper proposal. Since then, the devolution process has continued with the closing of most Indian Affairs offices in BC, and the opening of tribal councils, band offices, and the like, the Indians began to administer Indian Affairs programs and services. There has been confusion this whole time, however. Indian Affairs wanted the Indians to simply take over administrating Indian Affairs programs and services, whereas the elders who spoke to the Union of BC and the chief researchers talked about self-government as being land stewards, managing our resources in our unceded homelands, not just administering Indian Affairs programs on our small reserves. Slide number 9, please. Tribal councils were formed because small bands lacked the capacity to administer large government programs like child welfare and health and education. In 1994, the Stala Nation Canada and the Stala Tribal Council agreed to form one single organization called the Stala Nation. I was its first president. In 1995, Stala Tribe filed its first land claim. Slide number 10. Stala First Nations submitted a letter of intent to negotiate a treaty within the BC Treaty Commission, thereby beginning the Stala Treaty journey. Slide number 11. We have never signed a treaty, yet Europeans have come. They've occupied our territories, they've taken our trees, they've taken our minerals. We've never been recognized for all that we've given up. A treaty will finally set us up on the correct path as a nation. Self-government was to serve two general objectives. The first, that our land rights would not be extinguished through the treaty-making process. And second, that through self-government, we would begin once again to manage our own lands and resources and to share in the benefits obtained from the sale of these resources, including forestry, mining, water, gas, and oil. That's managing our land's resources throughout our territory, not just on our reserves. So throughout treaty making, the band would continue on their track of devolution, continue to deliver federal government services, whereas the larger treaty table would focus on managing their unextinguished land rights and resources as negotiated through a treaty. Our main objective in the treaty, however, is the stewardship of our homeland and the management of our resources and the sharing of benefits from our own land. Slide number 12. Six communities in 2017 who remained in the treaty-making process have moved into stage 5 now of the 6-stage treaty process. $150 million has been offered as part of the land claim agreement, along with 25,000 acres of land. In 2018, a memorandum of understanding was signed by the federal government, provincial government, and the 6 treaty communities based on these principles: no extinguishment of title, and adaptable over time, changeable over time, to incorporate the principles in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, forgiveness of the past loans, and no new loans. And of course, we press for the now successful move, not having any taxes imposed on our land. We have tabled our self-government agreement with the main table of negotiation. We also are seeking to obtain an early transfer of cash and land in order to bolster support for treaty at the community level. That support has been waning over the years due to time it has taken to get through this process. The complication that has arisen is the reestablishment of tribes since the beginning of the treaty table in Stala. The other complication is that out of 24 bands, only 6 bands have continued in the process, raising larger issues of shared territory agreements and resource sharing arrangements with non-treaty Stala First Nations. The SXG, the Xwexwilmexw Government, has decided in a session that lands ought to be owned and controlled by the tribes. Tribes may also want to take the lead on lands management and resource sharing, and they should also be discussed and worked out in the treaty process. And this should also be discussed and worked out in the treaty process. Slide number 13. Where we are at now, we've made the move to establish the Xwexwilmexw Government vision, which means that the 6 chiefs sit in the House of Chiefs called the Xwexwilmexw, the House of Chiefs. There have been many new developments since the beginning of the treaty process that will impact the final agreement. One is that the federal government and the provincial government are now formally recognizing the existence of the right to self-government because of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Second is the acceptance that the Indigenous treaty makers no longer have to agree that their rights will be extinguished or modified in any way. Third is that all treaty loans have been forgiven and will no longer have to be repaid from treaty funds received once the treaty is signed. Fourth is the decision by the federal government that Section 87 tax shelter under the Indian Act will be extended to all federal lands transferred under the treaty. This applies to all existing Indian Act reserve lands. The provincial government has announced at the BCTC 25-year celebration in Vancouver 2022 that it would also do the same. It is yet to be exactly determined what this means on the ground. Slide 14. As of July 2023, you will retain all existing tax exemptions under the treaty. In other words, you don't pay tax at the gas pump and you won't have to pay tax purchasing any goods in stores on reserve and income tax. Fifth, pursuant to the RRR policy, that the RRR policy is the rights and recognition and reconciliation policy now developed with the federal government that amends the treaty-making process in BC. The federal and provincial government are now negotiating with the Summit of Chiefs, the chief negotiators, the issue of fee simple land transfer under the treaty. We're hoping to find a different way of transferring the lands. That we feel that there's a real danger of, even if we say that our rights aren't going to be extinguished, that if we accept fee simple lands, that inadvertently that land rights, the Indigenous rights, may be impacted in some way. 6, the federal government has entered an MOU with the Wet'suwet'en territory chiefs that recognizes their Aboriginal rights to their whole home territory. This has been an important political development. It's only an MOU, we realize that, but it is a step in the direction that we'd like to adopt in our own treaty-making process. Slide number 15. I know I've covered a lot of material, and just in recapping a little bit, I wanted to this evening's discussion to try to help answer some of the questions that I've been getting. One of which is, why do we still need a treaty if we can do all these other things through devolution of the Indian Act to the bands? The bands control the land now under the Land Management Act. The bands have jurisdiction over education. They're developing jurisdiction over child welfare through Bill C-92, and the list goes on and on. Indian Affairs is gradually closing all of its offices and turning over their responsibilities to the bands themselves. Well, this devolution process is not self-government. It's still managing Indian Affairs programs pursuant to the Indian Act. What we're talking about in self-government and what we're trying to achieve under a treaty is a status of a nation living within a nation that has original sovereignty, and that we have all the rights to self-government, and that certainly because we're a nation living within a nation, we're not going to build our own armies or have our own money decided and that sort of thing. We're only, we're not simply wanting to administer our own poverty under the Indian Act. We want to start creating our own laws, creating our own traditions based on our own values and based on our own understanding of how we relate to the land. So it's not the same as devolution, and that's what I was trying to get to in this process of this. The lecture tonight was that the government is devolving its responsibility to the First Nations through all of these transfer processes, but those transfer processes, this devolution process, is not self-government, and it's not what we're negotiating for. So I wanted to leave time for questions. I don't know how much time has passed. I guess it's been about a half an hour. So I don't know how many people are listening. Do we have any questions that people might have? Yeah, there's a hand went up there. Hello, go ahead.
Sorry, was that you, Leah? Did you have your hand up too? Okay, so first off, thank you. I feel I know I've gotten some very good literature, but there's something about hearing it verbal from you that feels like it landed on, no pun intended, landed on me in a different way. What do you see as further roadblocks? Like what is, or if any, like how long do you think? I know it's hard to predict the process, but what's your view going forward?
Well, part of the thing I think that we've been running up against as I work with the communities, I was on the bench before, and they asked me to come back and help to explain the process to the people. And quite frankly, the people, you know, we've been lied to for so long, and we've been left marginalized on our communities for so long, that Native people, I don't think, trust people very much. They don't really, they're very cautious about what's being done, and it's trying to help them understand what's going on and how this change is going to impact their lives. And I understand that. I totally understand that. It's a big step. It's a huge endeavor to get out from under the Indian Act and begin to become self-governing. And people worry about, am I still going to be able to, you know, have my dental care and my glasses, and all of those programs, of course, continue. All the treaties that have been written in British Columbia so far, all of those programs and services continue in the same way. The big difference is that the Nisga's, under the Nisga's agreement, have now managing their rights throughout the entire territory, and so they're landowners now. They own the land, and you know, under the Indian Act, if you have a piece of land on a reserve right now, you don't have title to it. You have what's called a possession ticket, and you can't take that to the bank and say, this is how much money I have in my land. Whereas people off the reserve can. their land might be worth $400,000 or $500,000, but 600,000 for a piece of property. But not so on an Indian reserve. We don't have equity in our land. Once the treaty happens and the fee simple land ownership will transfer to the bands, then the bands will own that land outright. And because the federal government has taken a position that we won't have to pay tax on it, then our tax-free status remains, but we get the benefit of the increased value of those lands, which is quite an important thing.
It's almost like the pseudo ownership, I imagine that, you know, with the certificates of possession there then. So can I, is it, if it's okay, can I ask a second question?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
So thank you for that. And the other question I have is, when I think of the trauma, if you will, that resulted in Native people lacking that trust, is there any work that's being done either at Stalo level, or did any happen in Nishka or anything like that, where the trauma gets frozen, right? So it's hard to retrust. Is any work being done around that at the Six Nation level?
Well, what we've been, when I got off the bench in 2017, they asked me to get involved and start going to the communities. And because I was around when we began the process in 2000 or 1995, and when I began to explain to people that they had questions, and they asked me questions, and but when we used to bring the lawyer out and some of the other folks, they wouldn't talk to them. I don't know why, but when our own people go out, I found this when we went out, our own people went out, they often would come up and tell me they felt better about hearing it from our own people than from someone else. So I just know that that's the trust issue. We try to, and when we were doing the consultation on the Constitution, to go out and to dinner table meetings. Families would invite us, we would go and we'd sit and have dinner with them and explain to them what we're doing, and not use $20 words, just talk to people on a regular basis so everybody gets to understand. And so, you know, we're aware that people are leery and that you know, we've been kind of pushed around for a long time, and so we're trying to do things slowly and trying to explain things in a good way to people.
Grand Chief, I think we have a couple of questions in the chat, unless somebody else put their hand up. Did I?
I don't see the chat. Can I?
It's okay, I can tell you.
Okay.
What considerations should we have when engaging in the treaty process regarding long-term concerns like economic development of Stalo communities or climate change?
Well, this is really important stuff. The climate change. You know, when we were stewards of the land, when we looked after this country ourselves, right? We followed principles. You took as much as you needed, and that was all. And when Europeans arrived, the rivers were full of fish, and the mountains were teeming with animals, and the trees were all standing. And they began to exploit this and sell it, and we're left in a situation now where a lot of the flooding that's occurring is because of the reduction in trees, the number of trees that are missing. But our people believed that the trees were alive, and that you could talk to the trees and you couldn't cut them down unless you really needed them. And so our belief system was built in to preserve and to prevent abuse of the environment, but that's not so with Western society. They see the environment and the animals, trees, minerals as something to be used and bought and sold. It's just totally different value system. You know, the long-term social economic problems that our communities are facing, we're been for the long time. We've been the poorest people in Canada, yet we're in our own homelands. And we've been living on the margins of economic development outside the circles. And now with the whole notion that we have unextinguished rights, you know, the corporations and the governments are going to have to come to us if they want development in our territory. And I'm thinking of this gondola development that's happening. You know, the government is not going to give a permit, as far as I know, unless the Stalo consent. And the Stalo need to try to get themselves together, sitting in one room, talk with each other, because, I mean, there's agreements being made in the treaty process and in other processes that are now requiring Indigenous consent for any development of any kind. And so we can have a real long-term impact on our own poverty if we can acknowledge and begin to work in self-governing and protecting our rights, but at the same time being cautious as to how we want to utilize our resources. You know, the salmon are disappearing, and fresh water even is disappearing. And 50 streams, as far as I know, been dried up between Vancouver and Hope over the last several years. And a lot of that, in my view, has to do with the overlogging that's taking place. So if we begin to really take our stewardship seriously and begin to take our place as stewards of the land, we can really have an impact on improving our own economic situation and seeing a change in how the environment, how the animals and plants are being utilized within our territory. So, you know, it's an opportunity we have now, I think, but some might argue it's a little too late, you know, but I don't think so. I think that the world needs Indigenous perspectives. They need Indigenous people to step forward and say, you know, you can't continue to exploit the resources like this without having regard for the future. Our people used to make decisions based on the principle of Tamir, 7 generations back, 7 generations into the future. How is that going to impact those people? Not just for us right now and what we benefit, but how do we ensure that these things are here for the future generations? That's the way we look at it. And I think it's high time that governments and corporations begin to incorporate Indigenous perspectives when it comes to developing and utilizing resources within our traditional territories.
Okay, we have another question that came from Facebook. It's from Vicky Lynn on Facebook. Each of our communities will need to produce our own revenue to survive. There will no longer be any government funding, she's asking.
That's been a popular misconception, is that once we push off and become self-governing, then the government's going to stop funding us. Well, right now, the federal government and First Nations are in the process of developing self-government agreements and treaties, are working on a new fiscal arrangement that will see First Nations getting funding no longer based on what your population is, but based on other formulas that really reflect what's happening on the ground in terms of needs. So this new formula, this new fiscal formulas are coming into place now. And we're just learning about this as a treaty group, as we're in stage 5. and we begin to talk about our own future fiscal arrangements, the government will continue funding our social programs like education, like housing, like economic development, like health. All of those services will continue. But because of UNDRIP, and they'll be continuing now under our direction, not under the direction of the other governments. There's a lady with her hand up. I don't know who that is. Go ahead. Yellow, or she's got green glasses and
They're
purple.
green and purple. Oh, I'm Shannon from Xwexwilmexw. I have a question about how will we ensure that our generations are protecting what we are fighting for? Because, you know, it's really disheartening for me to visit. I've been living in the States for 20 plus years now. And so when I come back to visit and see that everybody's selling off their land, how are we, as part of this treaty process, going to ensure that we're protecting what we're fighting for right now?
Well, my dear, I'm 72 now. I'm going to be 72 this year. Over half the populations of our Stala villages are under the age of 25. The young people are taking over. You guys are taking over. And how we protect our land and our resources, how we ensure that it's all going to be there for future generations, that's going to be in your hands. We need to get control of it, though, through the treaty process. We need to get our face in the door so that we can stop the destruction and the environmental degradation. But how we preserve it now, you know, one of the things that I think that needs to be looked at seriously is the development of indigenous parklands, for example, lands that can't be used for economic development, but that indigenous people themselves set aside as wetland resources, duck preserves, places that we can set aside for longhouse use, where people can go swimming and put away their cultural regalia without fear of people finding them. That's how we preserve our heritage and our culture for future generations. But there are tools that need to be picked up and utilized, but we need to get a hold of government powers and funding so that we can do that. Up in Haida Gwaii, when the Haida Gwaii were fighting on Lyle Island, the elders sat on the ground, they wouldn't move, and the logging trucks had to stop, and they made the whole area into a preserve for the Haida. And that's not the only place where we've seen that happen, where indigenous people have stopped development and said, no more. We want to preserve these areas for our future generations. And that's what we need to do here in Stalo as well. We can't be afraid to stand up and demonstrate and put ourselves on the line. You know, it was quite a few years ago when the elders, and I was the tribal chairman, they said, Steve, we want to go fishing. I said, but the river's closed. And they said, we want to go fishing. So we just went fishing. And I remember the newspaper people got there and the TV people got there with their cameras, with the police and the DFO, and me and I was the president, and Lester Ned was the vice president. Kenny Malloway was on his boat fishing for us. We didn't have any permits. We didn't have any licenses to do what we were doing. And we were cutting the fish up. The elders from all over the reserves were cutting the fish up and canning them right there in the spot. When the DFO got there, I told Lester, I said, well, when they come, I'll go with them. They need to arrest somebody, I'll go. But when they got there, they said to me, Steve, how's fishing? I said, well, we're doing pretty good. We're catching a lot of fish. And he says, okay. And he turned around and left, because we were exercising our rights to do that. They couldn't argue with us because we weren't selling it. We were canning it. We're feeding the elders. People were arriving with gunny sacks and taking fish away. You know, so we can't be afraid to stand up for our rights. That's how we preserve our rights. We have to stand up and fight for them sometimes.
Okay, I think there's there's a couple more questions, but this one came in first, and it's from Alita CPAS. She says, how are self-government treaty and specific land claims connected?
Okay. One of the things that we discovered when we were working with the Union of Chiefs about self-government and land claims is that the Indian elders did not want to sell their land. So I went to George Manuel and I said, George, how can we go into treaty negotiations if we can't sell our land? And he said, self-government. We'll manage our rights through self-government. That's what we're going to do. He said, he was telling me that in a hotel, motel with all of his kids. They were living in a motel in Kamloops. And I said, I understand now. So the answer to self-government, to land claims is self-government. We're not going to sell our rights. We're going to manage our rights. We're going to keep them alive through self-government. Specific claims, this thing arises because the government set up our reserves quite a few years ago. And then sometimes they would inadvertently sell them without telling anybody. They did that in Westminster years and years ago. They set aside a reserve for some of the people to live on in Westminster because our people were going there to work in the canneries. And then later on, they just sold it without telling anybody. Now we're in a process to get compensated for those lands that we lost by the government just selling them without telling us. So that's specific claims. That happens. That's what specific claims means. Once the reserve is set up, then the government has an obligation to act in our best interest, not in theirs. And when they don't consult us, when they sell our lands or they give the lands away, which they did in many cases, there was a reserve that was supposed to be set up here. Governor Douglas had promised us 2,000 acres between Coquitlam and the army base. There was a map drawn up about it. When the surveyors came along, they didn't give us the land. The Trutch said, "Oh, the Indians don't make potatoes, so they don't need that land." So they gave it to the white farmers. Well, that was a promise that the government had made, and that's, and as far as I'm concerned, is a specific claim. They should have given us that reserve, and that was promised by Governor Douglas. So there is a difference between specific claims and land claims, and specific claims has to do with once the reserves are set up, did they act in our best interest or not? And if they didn't, then we should be compensated. I hope that answers your question. That's a good question.
Okay, do we, there was one more. Do we have time for one more?
I don't know. I think so. It's only 6:20.
Okay, let's answer. Gareth Martin asks, with this coming land ownership, I'm sure there will be efforts to renaturalize some areas, but at the same time, will there be a collective agreement amongst the communities to become self-sustainable and reclaim a level of food sovereignty and in turn be able to reduce dependency on corporations off reserve?
Well, this is very exactly one of the pillars of our treaty process is self-sufficiency. The idea is we can't give to our next generation this idea of wardship that we've gotten from the federal government, this idea that that we need government support to survive. We shouldn't have to do that in our own country. And so just as we do want to preserve some areas for future generations, I'm hoping that we'll take some of the land that's close to Chilliwack or close to Agassiz and put it into a hotel or put it into a motel so that we can put some of our people to work. I'm hoping we can buy some golf courses, for example, or why not get a casino license and build a convention center so that we can put people to work. Many of the tribes in the United States have become self-sufficient because they have got revenues from these kinds of developments. And I know they come with their own social problems, but we have huge social problems because of poverty. And so as we become self-governing bodies, we shouldn't be afraid to face these challenges and find our own solutions.
Okay. I forgot that we do have our door prizes, so we better stop it there.
Oh,
And
okay, door prizes. Thank you for
Right.
everybody for listening. Thank you.
yes, thank you so much for your time and wonderful, wise words. And thank you everyone for all your questions. We I think we will try, I think there might have been one or two that we didn't get to, so we'll try to get those answers out to you after, like, in the coming days. So Sharon is on here somewhere, and I think we will, she's got a wheel of fortune that we're gonna spin. Okay, so just so we're gonna start with just so everyone knows, it's members on the wheel. And we're gonna start with the $200 first $200 card. We've got quite a few cards, so. And Janelle Johnson is the first winner. So we're gonna ask if you don't mind sending an email if you win a card with your address or with your mailing address, so that we make sure we have the correct one, or we can arrange to get it to you another way, but just send us an email at outreach@xwexgov.ca. Okay, the next one is another $200 card.
Oh,
Tracy Phillips.
Daisy Phillips.
Okay. And I think I saw that Kenny Chapman said his name was missing. There we go. Sorry, we're doing our best here to get everybody's names in. Okay. This is for $100 card. Tara Preisel. I hope I said that right. Congratulations. It's kind of quiet and funny to do it this way. Okay. Spinning the wheel again. Another $100 card. Emily Kelly. Hello, Emily. Okay, one $50 card. Brenda Sapas. And the next one is another 50. There's four $50 cards. That's Leah. Okay. We've got Taylin Malloway. So congratulations. and Lance Archie. So that is for $50 cards. And then we have one more prize. Oh,
Heather, it's Chief Bailey. I just have a quick question. I
Sure.
see on the chat that it's asking if the door prices are for the 6 SXG communities only.
yeah, it should be.
Okay, just seen that comment. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, we definitely, that is the policy, I guess. But if a name slips in because we made a mistake or something, sometimes that happens, but we do try to make sure that they're all members in the draws. And Kenny, good thing you got your name in. So that's $25 for you. And congratulations to everyone. Yay. Clap, clap, clap. Thank you so much again. And yeah, it's always fun trying these Zoom meetings. So there's a lot of moving parts in them sometimes. And we're doing what we can to make sure that we've got everybody's comments covered and that we have honored your presence here today. So thank you again for coming out. And Grand Chief, did you want to say some closing words?
Just to thank everybody, and if you still have questions, please send them to our office and we'll give you a response as soon as we can. Okay? Okay. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.